Your films have been very personal. This one is no exception because you're Brazilian, and the film is about the rise and fall of democracy in Brazil. And you say in the film that you and Brazilian democracy are basically the same age. It started in like the mid 80s. And now the country has sort of backslid into a dictatorship with its current president. So, can you give everyone a brief history of Brazilian democracy and how you decided to do the film?
Yes. So when I was young, my mother used to wear a T-shirt written "Give me democracy or give me death," and I grew up believing that democracy was my birthright, achieved from a lifetime of my parents fighting against the military dictatorship in Brazil that lasted from '64 until the mid '80s. And when in 2016 I started filming a protest I went down my apartment to film a protest that was asking for Dilma's impeachment. I realized it was kind of a wake-up call of how ephemeral even democracy can be. I saw hundreds and thousands of people dressed in the colors of the Brazilian flag, singing the national anthem, some of them asking for the return of the military, others asking for the imprisonment of anyone who was wearing red. And I filmed that, and from there on entered into a rabbit hole that took me into what was in many ways a nightmare, because Brazil, as the United States, as England, as many other countries in the world, in 2016 suffered kind of an earthquake where what we took for granted, I myself took for granted, which was democracy, became completely at risk. And that happened at first with a narrative that everyone was taking as normal, saying that the president should be impeached because of corruption. And it was only when I entered into the Congress and started filming in the Congress that I realized that she was not being impeached. And this is Dilma, our first female president. She was not being impeached for corruption, but for a crime of fiscal maneuver. Which is basically to hide the deficit in the like
the budget.
Yeah, in the budget, and most of the presidents had done that before her, so that they had created this narrative, which only becomes revealed months later. The reason for it, when an audio leak that seemed to have come from the House of Cards,
you play it twice.
yeah. Yeah, and at that moment, even I think the House of Cards tweeted, "We can't compete," which. But that audio leak had many senators that were saying she has to be impeached, otherwise we will all go to prison, because she's not stopping the corruption investigations. And that's another level of the story, which is the car wash operation, which was the hugest investigation into corruption in the history of Brazil, that started to take many politicians and big businessmen to prison because it uncovered a corruption scheme that had been going on in Brazil for decades. And Dilma, different from other presidents before her, was not interfering with the investigation. Usually, whenever an investigation would get close to revealing a corruption scheme, sometimes the president would change the chief of the police or have named the general prosecutors. The president a few years ago had the name of the nickname of his general prosecutor was the guy who puts everything in the drawer. So Dilma was allowing for the investigations to happen, and in a very dramatic way, the narrative inverted, and they all managed to make her look guilty for the corruption that they were wanting to save their skin from. And I managed to film that as it was happening, and also to get access to Dilma in this crucial historical moment where the country was somehow falling apart.
How difficult was it for you to get access to, because you had tremendous access to both her and Lula, who was the president before her, and also you got inside Congress. So how was it for you to get the access like that?
It wasn't easy. In Congress was somehow easier because the Brazilian Congress is supposed to be open for the people. It was harder than than it usually is to get access there, but it happened eventually. And then from there on, every congressman that I would meet that I knew Dilma or Lula, I would ask them to help me get access to them. I wrote them letters, which I later learned they never read, and kept insisting for months and months and didn't get an answer until I managed to infiltrate into a bus full of historians that were going to have a seminar with Dilma. And there I got into the presidential palace with these historians and met her for the first time and gave her a DVD of my first film and asked her if I could interview her. And she said yes, but it still took a while for her to allow me to interview her. And the first interview was extremely formal. I tried to set it outside in the presidential palace, which is a beautiful palace made by Oscar Niemeyer, so it wouldn't be just in an office. So we put all the lighting and did the set, and she came outside and she was like, "Do you think the impeachment is something bucolic that you can do outside like this? I'm not giving this interview anymore." And so she gave up. And then we managed to convince, we did the interview inside. It didn't even make it to the film, and it still took a year to get the access that you see in the film where I'm behind her in the car.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a great moment with her and your mother, and both of them, they have a shared history. They were both in prison back in the day because they were activists. And Dilma was very candid with your mother because she talked about like how she misses anonymity. So can you talk about filming that scene of the two of them?
Yeah, so when Dilma got elected, my mother made a list of 30 things they had in common. They're from the same city, were studied in the same school, were imprisoned in the same prison during the time of the dictatorship, but had not met. And I could understand a lot of Dilma through my mother as well. I think when you live through a dictatorship and you put your life at risk for so long, there's this kind of a psychological change that happens, and where Dilma was a person and a president completely different from Lula, who was our president before her. She was very closed off, and very and people complained about that, but I kind of empathized with it because of of my mother isn't similar to Dilma in that way, but there are a few things that they share. So it meant a lot to me to bring them into the same space, and it really was the moment where Dilma opens up the most, because she and my mother kind of share a moment of true complicity. And Dilma also says at that moment that she didn't want to be president, which was a huge revelation she had not given to anyone, that it happened. So it's quite tragic.
Mm-hmm. You incorporate a lot of your personal story and your family's personal story because your grandfather also owned a construction company that's aligned with the rich. So what are the challenges of doing a film that's part reporting and part memoir almost?
Well, for me, I wanted to what made me want to make this film was the idea of the relationship between a citizen and his or her own democracy, and the utter pain that you feel when you feel that your democracy is at risk, because we grow up with the belief that we have a say in our political system, that we decide who is our president, and that is somehow the ground in which we stand. And when you realize that that's not actually the case, which was the case in Brazil, where people were deciding behind the scenes what would happen politically, and that had not anything to do with your vote. And I think that happens in the United States in many similar ways. I think we're kind of a distorted mirror of each other, the United States and Brazil, where and many other countries as well are feeling, and that's why protests are ecloding everywhere at this moment, that citizens no longer have a say on the democratic process, that it's been co-opted by huge corporations, by huge lobby systems, by the manipulation of social media. And how do we get democracy back? I think that's the challenge that is paralyzing everyone. And I made the film kind of from wanting to investigate first the feeling of trauma, which is something that inspires me throughout my filmmaking. My first film was a film about the death of my sister, Elena, who committed suicide. And the second film is kind of the dilemmas of pregnancy. And in this film, it's the trauma of losing what was your ground, which is democracy, and the paralysis that come from that. So the first step to cure trauma is to retell. And in the retelling, you start understanding that what you thought was because when you're traumatized, it becomes utter confusion. What you thought and what you use to make sense of your reality, you lose. And that is what I tried to do with the film. So I could have done a straightforward current affairs political documentary, but I was interested precisely in that personal political, and also in trying to get into the themes that were kind of Shakespearean and the Greek tragedy aspect of it, and how sometimes the fate of one or two individuals, because they are the presidents, can lead the entire country into a tragedy.
Mm-hmm. The film doesn't make outright parallels to like Brexit or Trump here, but it's a cautionary tale about like what could happen. I feel like everyone here should watch your movie just to see. Did you consider making those connections more explicit in the film?
No, I think they were, for me, explicit. I think for me it was the utter sensation of pain that I felt. I didn't understand it because Brazil's process of erosion of democracy started in March. And then in June happened Brexit. And I started reading what people were writing from Brexit. There was one guy who said, "How do I feel with Brexit?" And he said, "It's like being punched in the face, but very slowly." I was like, exactly. That's what I've been feeling. And then with Trump, like that, the election of Trump, then millions of people started writing as well, the sensation of grief, of paralysis, of complete disturbances. So I understood what I was going through by reading these foreign accounts. But I didn't feel the necessity of saying this and that. But one thing that helped me a lot in the process as well of understanding politically what had happened in Brazil was this book called How Democracies Die, which I recommend anyone who's interested in democracy to read, because sometimes when you have political processes, be it Brexit, be it an impeachment happening, it's hard to understand what is what opinions are motivated by passion and what is really about the rule of law. And this book really shows how democracies have been abused in the past decades in many different places around the world and how it happens. And the main thing that I learned from it is the idea that the Constitution is not enough to protect democracy. What protects democracy are two unwritten norms, which are mutual respect and forbearance. So the idea that you could say that your opponent is part of a terrorist group, but you won't say because you have mutual respect. You could do an impeachment against your opponent without a cause, but you won't because you have self-control. But also the understanding of what the impeachment law actually is. In Brazil, it was an abuse of the law, and here in the United States, it's very different. It's kind of at the root of the impeachment law, which is to prevent this kind of abuse of authority that the president did and manipulation of foreign elections by bullying a foreign nation into it. So otherwise, you can get, like when I was filming, several people I interviewed would say Dilma's impeachment should happen because it's constitutional. Well, it is possible through the Constitution, but it's not a good use of the Constitution because it's what they call constitutional hardballing. It's abusing of the Constitution to destroy your opponent. And then you win, but you destroy democracy as a consequence of it.
Like, what do you hope people will get out of the film, especially in Brazil?
Well, the film has been on Netflix since June in 190 countries, and in Brazil, it's been really beautiful to see. Like I've get a lot of accounts from people, such as one young woman who wrote that after seeing the film, she and her best friend that had not been speaking for 2 years started speaking again because they started through the film feeling empathy for their different political points of views. So that's what I had most hoped for. Or other people who say, thank you, I was so wrong and brainwashed into believing all these things, and the film kind of clarified for me what happened. So these things are really what I had hoped for, because there was one narrative only before that was available to people, which was a narrative that politics in general had become corrupt, and that only an outsider maybe could solve the situation. And that's a very risky narrative, because when you criminalize politics, you leave space for authoritarianship. Only that will survive. And the consequence of that in Brazil has been very dangerous. What we see now happening is a 90% increase in deforestation in the Amazon, when it's already at a tipping point where it can become a savanna at any moment. A huge increase of police killings in Rio. Rio, just the state of Rio, has more people killed by the police than the entire United States. And the president and the governor are saying that a good policeman is a policeman that kills.
Okay.
So it's like legislated genocide that is happening against black people and indigenous people in Brazil.